at the Bone Museum, we have a skull with an STD, and people's first reaction to seeing it is usually, I didn't know it could do that. Now let's back it up a little bit. We all remember in health class where some of us were unlucky enough to get a front row seat to photos of the effects of STDs on the skin, and only the skin. But back in the day, people were not as privileged when it came to learning about the safety in the bed, and not only did their skin pay the price, but so did their bones. In our video, 12 unique artifacts at the Bone Museum, which thanks to all of you guys is reaching 200,000 views, we briefly touched upon this piece right here. This is a skull with syphilis. But what is syphilis? Let's talk about its history and a deep dive into its skeletal implications. Before we get started, we have a very special announcement from our first sponsor, us! Do you want to support the museum but can't come in person? The Bone Museum is excited to announce that we are launching our online gift shop very soon, and you will be able to get your hands on all of this cool merchandise that we showed you and more if you click on the link in the description. T-shirts, mugs, jewelry, sweaters, tote bags, and so much more just waiting for you. And now back to the video. Now let's get technical. Syphilis is caused by this very unassuming spiral here called Treponema pallidum bacterium, which is part of the Spirochaetaceae family. Now there are 3 other treponemal species that cause human treponemal disease: yaws, pinta, and bedule or endemic syphilis. And while they do share a very similar name, Treponema pallidum or syphilis and Treponema pallidum endemicum or bedule are not the same disease, and bedule is not sexually transmitted. The 4 diseases are morphologically indistinguishable from each other, and syphilis is the only one that is sexually transmitted. The other ones are spread through skin-to-skin contact. For this video, we're only going to focus on Treponema pallidum or syphilis, but the other treponema diseases are going to become important later. So where did syphilis come from? Well, the answer is a little more complicated and petty than you might think. Syphilis wasn't even the disease's original name. The earliest attempt came from Parisian physician Jean Fernelius, who coined the term Luis venerea or venereal pest. I think you can tell why that name did not catch on, and can you imagine if we had to make this video saying Luis venerea 100 times instead of syphilis? No thank you. Fast forward to Italy 1530. Poet Girolamo Francastoro publishes a narrative poem titled Syphilis sive morbus gallicus, syphilis or the French disease. In it, a shepherd named Syphilis gets fed up with the god Apollo for starving his flock of sheep, ditches his worship, and pledges loyalty to King Alcinous instead. In return, Apollo curses Syphilis and his people with a horrifying new illness. And just like that, thanks to a fictional shepherd, syphilis got its name. Now, the poem was actually written to raise awareness about syphilis, though it very conveniently left out the whole wrap it before you do the deed part, which wouldn't come up for another couple centuries. Now, let's rewind a little bit. Syphilis and the French disease. Why are the French being called out here? Well, that is because Europe had a habit of playing the blame game, especially with countries that they were in political conflict with, and syphilis was no exception. The Italians, Germans, and the English called it the French disease. Meanwhile, the French spun it back at them and called it Neapolitan disease after Naples, Italy, which was believed to be the original outbreak site. The Russians called it the Polish disease. The Polish called it the German disease. The Danish, Portuguese, and North Africa called it the Spanish disease, and in Turkey it was the Christian disease. No guys, chill, it was just syphilis, the people's disease. End of story. And while everyone was busy playing the blame game, the people who were infected were paying the price. And some people are still paying the price for that today. So let's have some help going over the stages of syphilis and how it affects a modern society. We know that syphilis cases are on the rise in New York City, where the Bone Museum is located, and in order to spread awareness, we have partnered with a graduate student from NYU on a public health initiative.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I have an academic background in anthropology. Thus, I'm partnering with the research division of the Bone Museum to finish a work-study program on skeletal health in New York City. Syphilis progresses through distinct stages if left untreated, beginning with primary syphilis, which typically appears about 3 weeks after exposure. The hallmark of this stage is a single, firm, painless sore called a canker, not to be confused with canker sores. The syphilitic canker usually appears on the mouth, genitals, or anus, wherever the bacteria has entered the body. This sore will heal on its own in a few weeks, but that does not mean that the infection has left the body. It'll continue to spread. If left untreated, the infection advances to secondary syphilis, which is characterized by more systemic symptoms such as a non-itchy rash, often on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. One might experience swollen lymph nodes, fever, hair loss, and wart-like lesions in moist areas such as your mouth and genitals. These symptoms may all resolve on their own, but again, the infection persists. Following the secondary stage is early latent syphilis, a period when the infection is present in the body but no symptoms are visible. This stage is classified as early if it occurs within 1 year of the original infection. Despite the absence of symptoms, individuals in the early latent stage remain infectious, especially to sexual partners. Early detection and treatment are critical at all stages, not only to prevent long-term complications such as neurological or cardiovascular damage, but also to interrupt the chain of transmission and protect the public health. If syphilis remains untreated beyond the first year, it enters the late latent stage. During this time, the infection is typically not contagious through sexual contact, but the bacteria remains in the body and can eventually cause severe damage. Although individuals may feel well, syphilis can silently harm their internal organs over time, which is why regular STI testing and treatment are so important. The final and most serious stage is tertiary syphilis. Tertiary syphilis may occur 10 to 30 years after your initial infection. At this point, the disease can damage the brain, nerves, heart, blood vessels, liver, and bones. Common complications include brain and spinal cord damage, cardiovascular dysfunction, and destructive soft tissue lesions. Tertiary syphilis can result in permanent disability or death. While advanced cases are now rare thanks to modern testing and antibiotics, they remain a risk when early stages are missed or untreated. Bone Museum is based in New York City, which is now experiencing a spike in certain types of syphilis infection. Congenital syphilis is a growing public health concern in New York City. It happens when a pregnant person passes syphilis to their baby during pregnancy, often without knowing that they were ever infected. In 2023, New York City saw 35 cases of congenital syphilis, a 67% increase from the year before. Congenital syphilis can result in stillbirth, low birth weight, premature delivery, or death shortly after birth. It's completely preventable, but without treatment, syphilis can stay in the body and silently harm both a pregnant person and their baby. This is why New York City law now requires syphilis testing 3 times during pregnancy: at the first prenatal visit, again in the 3rd trimester, and at delivery. Testing early and often is one of the most effective ways to protect newborns. The New York City Department of Health attributes most cases to missed opportunities for early screening and treatment, issues that disproportionately affect communities of color and high-poverty neighborhoods. If someone is found to have a syphilis infection, treatment is safe, simple, and effective. Usually just a few injections of antibiotics. However, a national shortage of Bacillin LA antibiotics has made supply management essential. New York City now prioritizes this medication for pregnant patients and neonates. Also, here in New York City, sexual health clinics offer free or low-cost testing to anyone aged 12 and up, thankfully regardless of insurance or immigration status. You can even call their hotline to ask questions or schedule a visit. Congenital syphilis is 100% preventable with timely care and is thus a sentinel indicator of gaps in reproductive and sexual health care. We can close these gaps by encouraging screening and supporting community health to ensure that every pregnancy in New York City has a chance for a healthy outcome. I would like to thank the Bone Museum for giving me a platform to discuss sexual health in New York City.
And we would like to thank Olivia for utilizing the Bone Museum's resources to spread awareness about conditions that are disproportionately affecting underprivileged communities in New York City. Our goal at the Bone Museum here is to spread awareness about various medical conditions that can affect the human skeleton, and we thank Olivia for utilizing the resources in the Bone Museum to help us build on our mission. Now for this video, we're only going to talk about syphilis effects on the bones, as we are the Bone Museum. What you're seeing here is the various presentations of syphilis on the bone. But how does this actually happen? Where did a disease this complex and disastrous for the bones even start? Unfortunately, even today, there's not a clear answer as to where syphilis originated from. But let's take a look at some of the leading theories, outside of the whole blame game thing, of course. The first and the most widely accepted theory is the Columbian hypothesis. This hypothesis links the sudden European outbreak to the Columbian exchange. So the Europeans brought over smallpox and brought back syphilis. The next theory is the pre-Columbian hypothesis. This theory suggests that syphilis existed in both Europe and the Americas previously to Christopher Columbus's voyages, and before his return in Europe, a lot of the times those conditions were misdiagnosed as leprosy, that there had been some kind of mutation and evolution of a disease within the Trypanemal family. And last but not least is the Unitarian hypothesis. This is considered a variant of the pre-Columbian theory and suggests that all Trypanemal diseases are merely a different expression of the same infection that had adapted to environmental, geographical, and cultural factors. The pre-Columbian theory remains the most widely widely accepted as there had been no concrete DNA evidence that proves the existence of syphilis in Europe prior to Columbus's return. Let's take a look at a couple of research studies that work to crack the ever-elusive origin of syphilis. In the late 1800s, Dr. Joseph Jones, a physician and early American archaeologist, published reports on skeletal remains he studied from Native American burial grounds in the southern United States, particularly Tennessee and Georgia. In his work, he described bone lesions on several skeletons that he interpreted as signs of chronic treponemal infection or syphilis. He noted skulls with irregular pitting, bones with periosteal reaction, as well as skull destruction that was consistent with late-stage syphilitic gummas. These findings led him to believe that syphilis or related treponemal diseases existed among the indigenous populations prior to European contact. His work was some of the first to use actual skeletal evidence to argue that syphilis had roots in the Americas rather than being brought over from Europe. In 2018, PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases Study published the first successful recovery of ancient treponemal DNA from remains buried in colonial-era cemeteries in Mexico City. The researchers examined 3 individuals labeled 94A, 94B, and 133, whose skeletal remains displayed lesions consistent with syphilitic infection. These included widespread periosteal inflammation, multi-layered bone new formation along the shaft of long bones, and signs of diaphyseal expansion. One individual showed evidence of dactylitis, bone swelling at the ends of fingers or toes, and cranial remains showed abnormal periosteal bone activity, further supporting the diagnosis. Ancient DNA analysis confirmed the presence of Treponema pallidum in all 3 individuals. A 2024 study from the Smithsonian Magazine examined 2,000-year-old skeletal remains from the Jabuticabira II burial site on Brazil's southeast coast. These remains displayed periosteal bone lesions and inflammation consistent with ancient treponemal infection, diseases related to syphilis, yaws, and Begel. Researchers successfully sequenced ancient Treponema pallidum-like DNA from 4 individuals. Interestingly, the bacteria strain they found closely resembled modern Begel in non-sexually transmitted variant common in arid regions. This discovery indicates that treponemal diseases have been infecting humans in the Americas for at least 2,000 years, greatly predating Columbus's arrival. Now this one's a doozy. In 2001, an episode of Secrets of the Dead aired titled The Syphilitic Enigma, which claimed to overturn the Columbian theory.
Paleopathologist Charlotte Roberts has discovered a skeleton that she believes will rewrite history and challenge the accepted wisdom about where syphilis came from and how it spread.
At the center of the episode is skeleton 216, which was found at the Hull Friary in England and claims to show lesions consistent with syphilitic infection.
There was a lot of infectious disease in the site, including what we thought were classic cases of syphilis. And this one here, 1216, this 25 to 35-year-old male is one good example. In fact, it's the best example.
The skull of 216 showcases classic signs like Kari-Sika, pitting and scarring on the bone, commonly associated with late-stage syphilis. Even more shocking, radiocarbon dating initially placed the skeleton between AD 1300 and 1430, well before Columbus set sail.
There are well-dated sites in the Dominican Republic, and among these sites are some which are dated to the time just prior to Columbus, from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And this is exactly the timing that we need to know whether syphilis existed. Because if we find syphilis in these bones, then we know the people who met Columbus are the people who had syphilis, and therefore Columbus and his crew had the opportunity to interact with people with syphilis, and therefore opportunity to contract the disease and to spread it.
The documentary also claimed that 60% of the 245 skeletons at the site had syphilis-like lesions. Sounds like a pre-Columbian syphilis case, right? Not so fast. Skeleton 1216 was radiocarbon dated again in 2003, and the new date range was 1430 to 1611, barely overlapping with the previous pre-Columbian dates, bringing it well past into the post-Columbian period. And because Hull was a coastal town, the residents most likely ate a lot of seafood, which affects the accuracy of radiocarbon dating due to marine reservoir effect. When adjusted for the marine reservoir effect, the new date range for skeleton 1216 is between AD 1492 and 1657, well past Columbus's return. A 2024 paper published in the Science Journal describes how scientists were able to reconstruct 5 ancient Treponema pallidum genomes from skeletal remains uncovered in Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Argentina, with radiocarbon dating placing it as far back as 9,000 years before present. They examined elements including hip bones, ribs, and even a tooth, all showed extensive periosteal reactions. Periosteal reactions, diaphyseal expansion, and localized inflammatory lesions which can be signs of treponemal infection. While such skeletal changes alone cannot specify whether the pathogen was venereal syphilis or a related form like yaws or bedrol, the combination of these distinctive bony lesions and the ancient DNA evidence firmly indicates that the treponemal disease was circulating in the Americas millennia before any European contact. Now, this next theory is an often overlooked one, but also challenges the Columbian hypothesis. In 2017, researchers published a study examining skeletal remains found in northern Spain, designated as SAL 633. Radiocarbon dating placed these remains between AD 1879 and 1001, well before Columbus even set sail. The skull showed classic signs of advanced untreated syphilis, including large erosive lesions on the forehead, smooth pitting near the eyes, damage to the nasal cavity and hard palate, and CT scans revealing worm-eaten bone lesions consistent with gummatous destruction. Microscopic analysis of bone confirmed long-term inflammatory remodeling, further supporting the presence of a chronic infectious disease. While they couldn't rule out bedrol, the geographic and cultural context made it unlikely. The radiocarbon dating showed an estimate way before Columbus set sail. What makes this study especially interesting is it shows strong skeletal evidence that syphilis was around in Europe centuries before Columbus set sail, but it is often overlooked because it was published in a lesser-known journal and also does not include DNA evidence, which is becoming more and more necessary. So let's say Columbus did bring back syphilis. And let's be clear here, we do not blame the indigenous populations in America. We blame the pillagers that came in, forced themselves in, did unspeakable things, and then went back to Europe. So if Columbus did bring back syphilis from Europe, how did it spread across the region? How many people were on that ship? Oh, hi baby. In order to get that answer, we have to go all the way back to Naples. In the winter of 1489, a debt went unpaid, and that debt sent such a ripple across Europe in a way that no one could have ever imagined. Pope Innocent VIII was furious at Ferdinand I of Naples for not paying his debts, so he offered the Kingdom of Naples to Charles VIII of France, who had a distant claim to it through his grandmother. When Ferdinand I died in 1494, his son Alfonso II wanted to stake a claim on Milan. This terrified Milan's ruler Ludovicus Ferraza, so he invited Charles VIII and his armies into Italy, setting off an invasion unlike the peninsula had ever seen before. Charles moved at an astonishing speed, and him and his army of 25,000 mercenaries marched into Rome and spent a month of frivolous activities and vice there. I think you guys know where this is going. In 1495, they marched into Naples and were at first greeted as liberators. But the celebration didn't last long, as his rule very quickly turned exploitative, and the rulers of Italy, including Ferraza, all turned against him. In 1495, they met him at the Battle of Fronovo. Charles' forces pushed back, but the true implications of this campaign would not be remembered in territory. Italian physicians had begun to notice a terrifying new disease spreading across the French soldiers, oozing pustules, chronic pain, and a clear link to sexual contact. It moved quickly amongst ranks, into the streets, and across Europe. And now we get back into the blame game. So what does syphilis actually do to the body? We have all these bones on this table, but what are we actually looking at here? First, let's start with the skull. The bones of the skull, especially the cranial vault, have a rich but slow-moving blood supply, making them a prime location for the bacteria Treponema pallidum to settle and persist. Here we have our original syphilis skull on display here at the Bone Museum. And this is a replica cast made by the company Bone Clones, and you could really see that they accentuated the Kari sicca here. In tertiary syphilis, the body tries to eliminate the lingering bacteria by creating these immune-driven nodules called gummas. These are soft lesions that attempt to wall off the infection, but as they grow and spread, they cause localized tissue death, destroying surrounding bone. Your body, in turn, tries to contain the infection by laying down new bone in irregular patterns to contain and isolate the infection. This constant cycle of destruction and repair is what causes the telltale circular radial pattern that we associate with Sicca or prolonged syphilitic infection. Another sign of syphilis is the collapse of the nose bridge, also called a saddle nose deformity. The damage was oftentimes permanent, and back in the day it was a telltale sign of untreated prolonged syphilis. But contrary to popular belief, it did not actually make your nose fall off. Now here at the Bone Museum, we don't have a skull with a scalloped nose deformity. However, we do have a skull with leprosy. And if you remember, we did mention briefly that people believed that syphilis was mistaken for leprosy. We can see on the syphilis skull here that the nose bridge is very much present, however, very much absent on the leprosy one. Now, the reason for the nasal destruction in both syphilis and leprosy is very different, and in both syphilis and leprosy, skulls that include nasal damage can look pretty similar. Now, let's take a look at the presentation of syphilis in some of the other bones, because here at the Bone Museum, we have amassed a little bit of a collection of syphilitic bones. These two bones, a femur and a radius, show evidence of a condition called chronic periostitis. Similar to the Sicca, the trypanosoma pallidum is still lingering in the blood supply, and the femur and radius have very rich blood supply. But the key player here isn't the bone itself, it's the periosteum. The periosteum is a thin and highly sensitive membrane that covers nearly every bone in the human body. It contains nerves, blood vessels, and most importantly, osteoblasts, cells responsible for new bone formation. In a healthy individual, the periosteum helps maintain and repair bone throughout life. But when it becomes chronically irritated or inflamed, like in syphilis, it goes into overdrive. The reason for this response is protective. The body doesn't necessarily recognize trypanosoma pallidum as a bacteria to be destroyed in a typical immune response. Instead, it attempts to contain the bone infection locally. One of the ways that it does this is by thickening and reinforcing the outer layer of bone. The periosteum begins to lay down new layers of bone in a defensive, almost panicked fashion, laying down layers of immature new bone in an effort to contain and isolate the infection. This result is a process known as a periosteal reaction. Over time, the inflammation persists and these layers accumulate and remodel. The result is a bone surface that looks irregular, rigid, or layered like tree rings laid down unevenly. In extreme cases, the continuous stress and added bone growth can even distort the shape of the bone itself. Now, the Sicca and the periostitis look like two completely different reactions. But why? Unlike many bacteria, trypanosoma pallidum is a master of immune evasion. It has very few recognizable surface proteins, meaning the immune system struggles to target it directly. The body launches a chronic low-level immune response, not trying to eliminate it outright, but to contain it. And this containment strategy plays out differently in different parts of the skeleton. In long bones, the immune system activates the periosteum to lay down layers of immature bone in order to contain the infection. And in the skull, the immune system forms gummas, which works on eliminating and destroying parts of the bone that hold on to the infection. So how did people back in the day deal with this? In the Americas, there was evidence of various plants being used as treatment for syphilis. In Europe, one of the first treatments was also an herbal treatment of plants that were seen as blood cleansers. And later, the most common treatment for syphilis became mercury. Mercury, when consumed in large doses, causes salivation and sweating, which was believed to purge the bacteria from the body. Because mercury became such a widely used treatment for syphilis, the phrase, "for a night with Venus, a life with Mercury," emerged. Now, in 1908, while trying to find a cure for trypanosoma brucei, Paul Ehrlich accidentally discovered compound 606, or salvarsan. This was the first effective treatment against syphilis, and its anti-syphilitic properties were discovered by Japanese bacteriologist Sakashiro Hata. And then in 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and this has led us to a much happier end of this video. Now, before we wrap up this video, as you should wrap it to prevent syphilis, here's a top 12 list of historical figures that were either believed to or confirmed to have had syphilis. Abraham Lincoln, Al Capone, Friedrich Nietzsche, Benito Mussolini, Ivan the Terrible, Edward Manet, Dostoevsky, Napoleon Bonaparte, King Henry VIII, Oscar Wilde, Vincent van Gogh, and Charles Baudelaire. All people whose bones we do not have at the museum, but are important historical figures to talk about the prevalence and the spread of syphilis. Here at the Bone Museum, it is our goal to raise awareness about medical conditions that affect human bone, including syphilis and others. So if you found this video interesting, make sure to like and subscribe and follow our other socials. And if you would like to come see this piece and others in person, make sure to visit us at the Bone Museum in Brooklyn, New York.